At full gallop, on a dust-choked road beside the shining sea, a king's chariot came apart beneath him. One moment he was closing on his quarry with a spear in his hand, exactly as he had closed on 13 men before. The next, a wheel leapt free of the axle. The car plunged into the earth, and the most feared charioteer in all of Greece was gone. It looked like an accident. It was not. Hidden inside that wreck was a pin of wax where a pin of bronze should have been, and behind the wax lay a bargain, a secret promise that would win a young man his bride and his kingdom, and would cost his family more than any kingdom has ever been worth. The young man's name was Pelops. His shoulder was made of ivory, his horses were a gift from the god of the sea and his descendants. Atreus, Agamemnon, Orestes would carry the weight of what he did for 100 years. How does a single race, run in a single afternoon, lay a curse on 4 generations of kings? That is the story tonight. The boy the gods brought back from death. The race that 13 suitors had already died running, and the betrayal above the waves that a falling man turned into a curse. If you enjoy these stories, take a moment to subscribe. It truly helps this channel, and tell me in the comments which myth you'd like next. Now go back to the very beginning, to a boy whose story started with his own death. Pelops was born a prince of Lydia in the rich hill country east of the Aegean Sea, and his father was Tantalus, a king so favored that the gods themselves once sat down to dine at his table. What Tantalus did at that dinner, and what his guests discovered before it was over, is a tale so dark that it stands as its own story, and this channel has told it in full. It is enough to say here that his crime involved his own son, and that no mortal ever fell further from the gods' grace. This story begins not with the crime, but with what the gods did afterward. Sorrowing over the boy who had been wronged, the immortals gathered what remained of Pelops and gave him to Clotho, eldest of the 3 fates, who set a great bronze cauldron over a holy fire. Into that cauldron went everything Pelops had been, and out of it, when the steam finally parted, he stepped alive, whole breathing, and more beautiful than he had ever been in his first life. One small part of him alone could not be restored, for one grieving goddess, distracted that day by a terrible loss of her own, had been the one guest deceived. Where that missing piece had been, the gods set a curve of gleaming ivory, fitted into his left shoulder, smooth and pale as moonlight on marble. For the rest of his days that shoulder would mark him out, living proof that here walked a man who had died and whom the gods had loved enough to bring back. Among the gods who watched the restored prince step from the cauldron, one watched longer than the rest. Poseidon, lord of the sea and master of horses, took such delight in the young man that he carried him off to Olympus for a season, to be raised in the bright halls of the gods, and the friendship formed there between the sea god and the mortal boy would one day decide the fate of kingdoms. When Pelops came of age and returned to the world of men, though, he found his inheritance poisoned. His father's name had become a byword for treachery, enemies pressed hard against Lydia's borders, and a young king out of Troy drove him at last from his homeland altogether. So Pelops gathered his followers and his treasure, turned his back on the east, and looked across the Aegean toward Greece, a land of small, fierce kingdoms where a man with royal blood and a god's friendship might yet build something of his own. And in Greece there waited a prize worth any crossing. In the western kingdom of Pisa, near the river where the sanctuary of Olympia would one day stand, lived a princess named Hippodamia, famed through the whole Greek world for her beauty. Princes and heroes from every corner of the land had traveled there to ask for her hand in marriage. Not one of them had lived to see a wedding. Her father had seen to that. What kind of king kills the men who come courting his daughter? The answer waited on the far shore. Oenomaus, king of Pisa, was a son of Ares, the god of war, and from his divine father he held 2 gifts, a spear that never missed its mark, and a team of horses swifter than the storm wind. He also carried a secret that governed everything he did. Years before, an oracle had warned him that he was fated to die at the hands of the man who married his daughter, and from that hour, Oenomaus had resolved that no such man would ever exist. Because he was a king, and could not simply turn away the princes of Greece. He dressed his refusal as a contest. Any suitor was free to take Hippodamia up into his chariot and race for the Isthmus of Corinth, far to the east, reach it, and she was his. The suitor was even granted a head start, while the king sacrificed a ram at the altar of Zeus. But when the smoke of the offering rose, Oenomaus would mount his chariot behind the horses of the war god, take the unerring spear in his hand, and hunt. No head start had ever been enough. 13 princes had accepted those terms, and 13 times the king had run his quarry down on the long road east, and the spear had done what it always did. Above the doors of his palace, the old poets say, he fixed grim tokens of every man who had tried, so that each new challenger rode in beneath the proof of all the rest. It was beneath those doors that a stranger with an ivory shoulder came driving at last into Pisa. By the time Pelops arrived in Pisa, all of Greece knew what courting Hippodamia cost, and still he came. Some say the tales of her beauty had drawn him across the sea. Others say that everything else fell away only when he first saw her, distant and grave, in the torchlight of her father's hall. Hippodamia, for her part, looked at this newcomer marked by the gods, and for the first time in 13 contests, the princess found herself wishing that a suitor would live. Wishing, however, was not speed. The king's horses had been bred by a god of war, and no mortal team had ever kept ahead of them for long. So on the night before he was to declare his challenge, Pelops went down alone to the edge of the dark sea. Standing where the cold waves broke around his ankles, he called out to Poseidon, reminding the god of an old affection, of the bright season on Olympus, of everything the sea had once meant to a boy given a second life, and he asked for a single gift, speed enough to survive. For a long while there was nothing but black water and the sound of the surf. Then, far out, the sea began to glow. Up out of the foam came a team of winged horses drawing a chariot of gold, so light and so swift that its wheels could skim the open ocean without ever wetting the axle. Poseidon had answered. And yet, standing before a god's own chariot, Pelops was still afraid, and that fear is where this story turns. 13 men had been brave after all, and 13 men were gone, and the spear of Oenomaus had never once missed. Whether the doubt belonged to Pelops himself, or whether, as some of the old poets whisper, it was Hippodamia who refused to gamble her love on a fair race, someone in those last hours went looking for a surer way and found it in a man named Myrtilus. Myrtilus was the king's own charioteer, a son of the god Hermes, and nobody living knew the royal chariot as he knew it. Every strap and joint of it, down to the bronze linchpins that held the wheels upon the axle. He was also a man who could be bought. On what exactly he was promised, the sources do not agree, though most name a rich share of the kingdom Pelops meant to win. Whatever the price was, Myrtilus accepted it. That night, in the darkness of the royal stables, he drew the bronze pins from the wheels of his master's chariot and set in their place pins molded from wax, perfect to the eye, firm to a testing thumb, and certain to fail under the heat and hammering of a true pursuit. The work was quietly done and quickly. At dawn, the grooms yoked the war god's horses to a chariot that looked exactly as it had always looked, and Oenomaus, who in 13 races had never once needed luck, did not think to check. The 14th race began in the pale light of early morning. Pelops took Hippodamia up beside him. The winged team surged forward, and the long road to the isthmus unrolled before the golden chariot through olive groves and open plain. Behind them, unhurried, Oenomaus finished his sacrifice at the altar of Zeus, and then the horses of Ares were loosed and the hunt was on. Mile after mile, just as in every race before, the gap began to close. However fast Poseidon's horses flew, the king's black team came on like a squall off the mountains, and by the time the road bent along the glittering sea, Pelops could hear wheels behind him, and Hippodamia, looking back, saw her father raise the spear that never missed. In that moment, the wax gave way. A wheel sprang from its axle and went bounding off across the plain, and the king's chariot swerved, dropped, and tore itself to pieces at full gallop in a storm of dust and splintered wood. the maddened horses dragging the wreck on down the road until the reins at last ran out. Far ahead, the golden chariot slowed and turned. When the dust had settled, the king of Pisa lay still and small beside the ruin of his war car, and his long, cruel game was over. But Oenomaus did not leave the world in silence. Understanding, in his final moments, exactly what had been done to him and by whom, he spent his last breath on a curse. That Myrtilus, the betrayer, would himself be destroyed by the very man he had betrayed his master for. Everything Pelops had crossed the sea for was suddenly his: the bride, the kingdom, the fame of having broken the unbeatable king. One debt remained, and it rode along with them. Myrtilus came to claim what he had been promised, and somewhere on the cliff roads high above the sea, the reckoning came due. What passed between the two men in those last minutes is told in different ways. Some say Pelops had never intended to honor the bargain at all, while others say Myrtilus grew careless, boasting too freely of the trick that had won the race for them both. On the ending, every version agrees. As the golden chariot swept along the edge of the cliffs in the failing evening light, Pelops turned and cast the charioteer out of it, over the brink, down toward the dark water far below. Myrtilus, son of Hermes, did not waste his fall on screaming. Falling, he cursed Pelops, and not the man alone, but his house and his blood, his children and his children's children, down through every generation that would ever bear his name. Then the sea closed over him, and to this day, that stretch of gray water is called the Myrtuan Sea, after the man it swallowed. Hermes heard his son's last words, and the gods, who had forgiven Pelops so much, did not forgive this. Pelops was cleansed of the deed in the proper rites, the stories say, and he prospered as few kings have ever prospered. But a dying man's curse, with a god for a father and a true wrong for a witness, does not wash away. It waits. To every eye in Greece, the story of Pelops ended in glory. His power spread outward from Pisa until the whole southern peninsula of the country carried his name, as it carries it still. The Peloponnese, the island of Pelops, and beside the sanctuary at Olympia, where the sacred games would one day be run, pilgrims honored his tomb like the resting place of a god. He and Hippodamia ruled long, and their children married into half the thrones of Greece. But the curse of Myrtilus kept its own patient calendar. Passing over Pelops himself, as such curses often do, it settled instead upon his sons. Atreus and Thyestes began as brothers and ended as the bitterest enemies in all of Greek legend, answering each other's treacheries with worse, until one of them sat down as an unknowing guest at a feast prepared in the old, unspeakable manner of Tantalus, the family's first crime, come home as its inheritance. From Atreus came Agamemnon, the high king who led 1,000 ships to Troy and survived 10 years of war, only to be struck down in his own hall on the very day of his homecoming. And from Agamemnon came Orestes, driven to a deed no son should ever have to weigh, and hunted across Greece by the Furies for it. 4 generations paid for one broken promise above the sea. Perhaps that is what this story was always about, not the race, but the shortcut. The gods could rebuild Pelops from death itself, setting ivory where he had been broken. No power in heaven could mend a promise he chose to break. The wax failed in an afternoon. The debt it bought ran for 100 years. If this is the kind of story you want more of, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments which myth I should tell next. Sleep well.